Welcome back, class. I hope everybody's having a good morning and is ready for our very first full-length lecture in modern American literature. This is hopefully going to sort of supplement what in-class discussion would have created. And I'm going to walk you through just the core, walk you through our readings today and kind of go over just some significant I don't know, just some sort of some significant thoughts or considerations when we're looking at this period of modern American literature. Something that I'm also doing, just because a lot of you have referenced that many of you are going to miss the sort of sense of meditative and creative and explorative interactions that our on-ground class had. I've actually been writing one poem every day since the beginning of our suggested social distancing. And I thought that I would share with you at the beginning of every lecture the poem that I had written for you. So this poem is titled "We Kiss at the Moon." The week moves slowly. The week moves silently as the mood fades from silhouette to rain for the seventh day in a string of days mapped out to be the same pattern I've always been aware of but could avoid with busy work and time chasing. Now watching the hydrangeas bloom where my mother planted them last, I realize the thunder makes us strange familiar. It marks a revelation in current along the mundane. We work to find ourselves in time, but you are always here. I just stopped looking for you in the vines that weave between us until the world paused. I've missed you. How I've missed you. And so now as we move forward with the lecture, again, I just think it's very strange how in all of my classes, actually, not just in the poetry class, we're arriving here at modernism together, and it's at this time. And it is the perfect time to arrive at modernism because we're having to look at the depravity of what man is capable of. We're having to look at the impact that man is having on his social environment, on his global environment, on his ecological environment, and begin to question it and attempt to find purpose. So I actually wanted to begin by revisiting Eliot and just sort of recalling that's the anxiety or the age of anxiety and looking at the hollow men again. So as a reminder, here we are, modern American literature, post-World War I, and we're going to read The Hollow Men by Eliot.
The hollow men. We are the hollow men. We are the stuffed men, leaning together, headpiece filled with straw, alas. Our dried voices, when we whisper together, are quiet and meaningless as wind in dry grass. or rats' feet over broken glass in our dry cellar. Shape without form, shade without color, paralyzed force, gesture without motion. Those who have crossed with direct eyes to death's other kingdom remember us, if at all, not as lost, violent souls, but only as the hollow men, the stuffed men. Eyes I dare not meet in dreams, in death's dream kingdom, these do not appear. There the eyes are sunlight on a broken column. There is a tree swinging, and voices are in the wind singing, more distant and more solemn than a fading star. Let me be no nearer in death's dream kingdom. Let me also wear such deliberate disguises, rat's coat, crowskin, crossed staves in a field, behaving as the wind behaves, no nearer. Not that final meeting in the twilight kingdom. This is the dead land. This is cactus land. Here the stone images are raised. Here they receive the supplication of a dead man's hand under the twinkle of a fading star. Is it like this in death's other kingdom? Waking alone at the hour when we are trembling with tenderness, lips that would kiss form prayers to broken stone. The eyes are not here, there are no eyes here in this valley of dying stars, in this hollow valley, this broken jaw of our lost kingdoms. In this last of meeting places we grope together and avoid speech, gathered on this beach of the humid river, sightless unless the eyes reappear as a perpetual star, multifoliate rose of death's twilight kingdom, the hope only of empty men. Here we go round the prickly pear, prickly pear, prickly pear. Here we go round the prickly pear at 5 o'clock in the morning. Between the idea and the reality, between the motion and the act, falls the shadow, for thine is the kingdom. Between the conception and the creation, between the emotion and the response, falls the shadow. Life is very long. Between the desire and the spasm, between the potency and the existence, between the essence and the descent, falls the shadow, for thine is the kingdom, for thine is, life is, for thine is thee. This is the way the world ends, this is the way the world ends, this is the way the world ends, not with a bang but a whimper. The hollow men.
Still having to kind of get used to the way that I click through with a video embedded. So we're looking now at the hollow men. Eliot is a very interesting American modernist voice. He's an expat. He goes and lives the majority of his life in England, where he's sort of taking a critical eye of America from an outsider's perspective. There's two ways that I would argue that you can read Eliot, right? And we're going to get, when we get further into the lecture, we're going to look at classicism, which is really what Eliot is probably most famous or most known for. That Eliot throughout his work is constantly making references to other works. And you can read Eliot for the act of annotation, right? Of finding out what he is referencing and how he is referencing it, and then creating meaning, but through the understanding of what his annotations are. That's not how I like to read Eliot. It's one of the reasons I chose to teach the Hollow Men and not the Wasteland. Um, is that I prefer to read Eliot for the emotional experience of having read Eliot, not for this sort of how could we say it? Not body, but sort of egoist braggart on how well read that Eliot is. We will begin with the footnote, though. I mean, with the epigraph, where he writes, "Mr. Kurtz, he dead, a penny for the old guy." Mr. Kurtz is from Paradise, is from The Heart of Darkness. Sorry, I apologize. He's the main character in The Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. And that's arguably, a lot of scholars have argued that that is the first real modernist work. Um, and it's a short novella if any of you are ever bored and during quarantine and you want to read something, it's a beautiful read. But Mr. Kurtz is the Hollow Man. He has no real substance. Instead, there's all this mythology that exists around Kurtz. Um, but he himself is an empty character, which you find out throughout the the novella. And then we have a penny for the old guy. And our footnote in the book states Guy Fawkes led a group of conspirators who planned to blow up the English House of the Commons in 1605. He was caught and executed before the plan was carried out. On the day of his execution, November 5th, children make straw effigies of the guy and beg for pennies for fireworks. Which, fun fact about me, I was actually married on November 5th. Remember the 5th of November. So I always laugh when I get to that footnote. And so there's definitely a penny for the old guy. We have that sort of, English playfulness that's happening. But we also see that throughout the poem, The Hollow Men, there's reference to the river Styx, the river Tumid, right? And so it can also be the pennies that we place on the eyes of the dead in order to pay their toll as they transition into the afterlife. And again, that the act of shielding one's eyes from those that surround him is very prevalent in the poem itself. So as I said, there's multiple ways that we can read Eliot. We can read Eliot for the act of annotation, but how I'm going to read Eliot with you today is more to understand the emotional, let's say emotional truth of the Hollow Men. We are the Hollow Men. We are the stuffed men, leaning together, headpiece filled with straw. Alas. Already we begin with a cry, right? Of lost, of wandering, of purposelessness. Alas. There's a lot of argument about how we're at the beginning, we're referencing already that sort of sensation of trench warfare. The Hollow Men is written in response to the Wasteland. And so throughout the Wasteland, we're also seeing this sort of symbolic reference to trench warfare. And so I think that here we do begin with that. We begin in a symbolic trench. We are the hollow men. We are the stuffed men leaning together, headpiece filled with straw, alas. Our dry voices, when we whisper together, are quiet and meaningless as wind in dry grass or rat's feet over broken glass in our dry cellar. We're being introduced to the landscape already, right? Where we're seeing that the environment that surrounds us is infertile, almost, we could argue. We're seeing that our voices are dry and meaningless, that we have nothing to say, we have no new imagination. We are that hollow, slow death. When I read this section, I also always think of Thoreau's "Is there not a wound of the conscience through which a man's real manhood bleeds to an everlasting death?" Right? Where we're becoming machine man, like we are hollow. We're also becoming perhaps aware of our hollowness for the first time, right? We're dealing with the age of anxiety. And so we know, or we are aware now of that emptiness, of that purposelessness. And with Eliot, he is critical of that emotional experience of this generation. He's wanting to return to the past, but he can't because he has no substance, right? Not Eliot, the speaker. There's a longing to return to the past and to understand oneself in the past, but knowing that we can never return because we are empty. We whisper together, are quiet and meaningless as wind and dry grass. Remember, dry, infertile, nearing death. That's a continuous theme throughout this. And the only thing in our cellar is emptiness, right? We talked a lot about the jar, right? There's this sort of rat's feet over broken glass in our dry cellar. So this is the sound of our voices, but that's also that we haven't been nourishing ourselves. All that is left is emptiness. And that emptiness is broken, it's shattered. Shape without form, shade without color, paralyzed force, gesture without motion. And we'll return to this idea again when we get to the final section of the Hollow Men, right? But it's this motionlessness, this lack of this sort of between state that we're in, we're juxtaposing shape without form. This is an impossible existence, but it's the feeling that we're experiencing now in our modern time, right? Because we are that shape without form. We are the lost. We are the hollow. We are the empty. Move my camera so I can lean back. Yeah. It's a weird sensation having to constantly be on a screen. Those who have crossed with direct eyes to death's other kingdom. Those who have crossed with direct eyes to death's other kingdom. So we're coming back to that previous generation, the generation that believed, the generation that fought, the generation who had purpose, who had religion even. And that's important when we read Eliot, and we'll see he references the Lord's Prayer in the 5th stanza, right? But what he's getting at here is he's pointing to, look here, you who had purpose, those who have crossed with direct eyes to death's other kingdom. We're being introduced. There's the dreams kingdom, death's dream kingdom, and then there's death's other kingdom. And here we're in death's other kingdom. Remember us, if at all. If you choose to think on us, those who came before, those who knew purpose, those who understood their purpose. Remember us, if at all, not as lost, violent souls, but only as the hollow men. The stuffed men. I apologize. Remember us, those who have crossed to just other in kingdom. We're looking at our parents. We're looking at our grandparents. We're looking at the generations before who created this sort of modern life for us that we may have be capable of destroying. And we're ashamed. The speaker here is ashamed. Remember us, if at all, not as lost, violent souls. We are necessarily bad, right? We're not evil. We are just empty. Again, we talked about it in class, right? The modernist looks at the void, right? Nietzsche has a great quote, to be careful how long you stare into the abyss, because eventually the abyss will stare back at you, right? We're looking at the blank, empty hollowness that life may be. But we can't live in that state of emptiness because it's too anxiety inducing, right? The age of anxiety. We can't deal with that. We can't deal with the lack of purpose. So what do? We paint it. We try to shield ourselves from the emptiness because we can't deal with it right now. Right? It's there. It's present. Think about Wallace Stevens' Sunday Morning poem, where she's aware that she is not going to church, but she's aware that this is also sort of a spiritual endeavor that she's on, right? That her worship is worshiping or spending that time in her own personal sense of worship, her own personal meditation. We're questioning all morality of the past, but Eliot's wanting us is ashamed of that. He's ashamed that we can't just accept life, that we have now this isolation, this anxiety of the purpose of life. Eyes I dare not meet in dreams in death's dream kingdom, these do not appear. There are the eyes. There the eyes are sunlight on a broken column, and the voices are the wind singing, more distant and more solemn than a fading star. Eyes, I remember that the cliche concept that the eyes, not cliche, but overused concept that the eyes are the window to the soul, right? Well, what if here Eliot is pointing out that the eyes are the window to the soul, right? And so he doesn't want to meet the eyes of the past because they'll see his emptiness. Let me be no nearer in death's dream kingdom. Let me also wear. Let me be no nearer. Let me also wear such deliberate disguises, rat's coats, crow's feet, cross staves in a field, behaving as the wind behaves no nearer, not that final meeting in death's dream kingdom. Let's turn now to, that was this one. Thank you. And let's look at the fourth section. Eyes are not here. There are no eyes here. In this valley of dying stars, in this hollow valley, this broken jaw of our lost kingdoms. In this last meeting place, we grope together and avoid speech, gathered on this beach of this tumid river. We're beginning to cross. Sightless unless the eyes reappear, as the perpetual star multifoliate rose of death's twilight kingdom, the hope only of empty men. And now's when we get into our final stanza, arguably one of the more strange ones. We begin with a nursery rhyme. Here we go round the prickly pear, prickly pear, prickly pear. Here we go round the prickly pear at 5 o'clock in the morning. We're beginning in this sort of sense of innocence, but this also like this sense of terror as well, right? That the prickly pear is different than the nursery rhyme. Here we go round the mulberry bush. This is the prickly pear. We're using alliteration and sound. It's one of the reasons too I like listening to Eliot read this poem, because the way that he reads this poem reveals a new sensation about the poem, right? And that it's very like a sort of forced staccato almost. The prickly pear creates that. Prickly pear, prickly pear. Here we go round the prickly pear at 5 o'clock in the morning. Um, it's sort of this like playfulness and approach to life, but also this sort of threat and terror and horror that's off in the distance. Between the idea and the reality, between the motion and the act falls the shadow, right? So it's between. We're between a lot. Again, we're coming back to that sense of juxtaposition. So between the idea and the reality falls the shadow. Between the motion and the act falls the shadow. That's the hollowness, right? And so it's in a way in everything that we do. Perhaps we're still going through the emotions or going through the motion of living that life of the past, right? Or of past generations. Maybe we're still practicing the religions of the past, but we're no longer doing it as a reality. We're not doing it authentically anymore. Instead, it's just this hollow sort of forced repetition. Just like we would learn the nursery rhyme, right? For thine is the kingdom. Referencing again the Lord's Prayer at that section. So there's this intermixing of nursery rhyme, of play, of danger, of emptiness, and then of now sort of like redemption, of a seeking of redemption. Between the conception and the creation, between the emotion and the response, falls the shadow. We are unable to do anything of substance. Again, Eliot's wanting to hearken back to the past. He's wanting us to return to the sense of purpose that generations before had, right? But we can't because we are hollow. Or maybe we're aware of our hollowness to a point we can no longer ignore it. And then we come back to this life is very long. We think of, again, we're going through this very mundane, very directionless, very routine life. And we're aware of that routine for the first time. So we're praying for redemption, but we're also aware of just how inescapable this is. Between the desire and the spasm, between the potency and the existence, between the essence and the descent, falls the shadow. It's in us from conception. We used to maybe call this um, original sin, but it's always been there. It's always been with us. For thine is the kingdom. For thine is life. Is for thine is the. This is the way the world ends. And then I've always read it differently. And so when I heard Eliot read it for the first time, the way I read it in my head, this is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. Not with a bang, but a whimper. But Eliot, this is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but a whimper. We want there to be this like sense of drama, right? We want there to be this huge act. We want there to be something that we can point to. But is it not more terrifying that there's nothing that we can point to? There isn't going to be this sort of cataclysmic event. Instead, it would be this just slow surrender. Not with a bang, but a whimper. Because we want to think that we would fight against it or that we would rage against it. But in reality, what we're seeing is that our dry voice is motionless, our emptiness. And it's that slow, uh, sort of death of the conscience that we just surrender to. And that's the way that the world ends. There is no event, there is no rage. It just slowly becomes commonplace. Not with a bang, but a whimper. And we're gonna come back to Robert Frost and Langston Hughes again, right? We've spent a lot of time on imagism. We've looked at Eliot now. Next class we'll be looking at modernist fiction, and so I think it's important that we first start with Frost and Hughes, because both of them are very sorts of transitional but yet high modernist figures, right? We're not looking at mowing anymore, but we'll be looking at birches, nothing gold can stay, home burial, and the road not taken. So let's first begin with Frost, right? And if any of you get bored and you want to start looking at pictures of Robert Frost, you should, because he has this very sort of like old, gray, weathered grandfather presence in his writing, right? Um, and so Frost is a very interesting poet, and one that I would argue is able to achieve as much popularity in his lifetime because he was perhaps misread, right? Frost has this sort of like air of a sweet old grandfather who's here just telling you poems about nature and about the New England landscape that we're all sort of looking for, right? And that he's got this sort of like sense of comfort and um, stillness, maybe even peacefulness in his writing. But a famous critic actually referred to Frost. Frost is the poet laureate, the national poet laureate, for 4 years, right? He's elected to the national poet laureate 4 years in a row, which is huge, right? This is a huge literary achievement. But sorry, but there's a famous critic that referred to Frost as one of the most horrific and terrifying poets of his generation. to which he didn't really refute. I read that instead his reaction was just that he felt strange to have been seen so closely. So when we read Frost, we have to read Frost for really what's apparent in the poem itself, and not sort of what the American unconscious or the American collective conscious is sort of swaying us to want to read Frost from. So nothing gold can stay. Nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold, her early leaf's a flower, but only so an hour. Then leaf subsides to leaf, so Eden sank to grief, so dawn goes down to day. Nothing gold can stay. We'll look at how Frost is very much aware of how sound is important in his poem, which is interesting because sound is something that matters a lot to both Frost and Hughes, right? But there is this sort of sense of simplicity and not approachful, but sort of welcoming quality to the poem, and that's made by his use of very simple language. Nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold. Her early leaf's a flower, but only so an hour. We have rhyming couplets, right? Gold, hold, flower, hour, leaf, grief, day, stay. And we have this like very beautiful like nature imagery happening. But really what Frost is getting at is this like slow descent that we have towards death, and that loss of the vigor or the innocence or the direction of life. Nature's first green is gold. And green, when we look at it, green symbolically can represent innocence, naivety, newness, inexperience. So nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold, her early leaf's a flower, but only so an hour. Then leaf subsides to leaf, so Eden sank to grief, so dawn goes down to day. Nothing gold can stay. We can never remain this innocent, this perfect green. And notice too that early leaves a flower. That's when we're young. That's when we're not matured yet. We haven't become the individual, right? Her early leaves a flower, but only so an hour. Only briefly are we that childlike, innocent. Only briefly are we not an individual or conscious being aware of our individuality, right? Nature's first green is gold. It's that perfect age. The perfect moment. Her hardest hue to hold. It's fleeting. Her early leaf's a flower, but only so an hour. Then leaf subsides to leaf. So Eden sank to grief. So then the decay happens, the decline happens, the loss occurs. So dawn goes down to day. Nothing gold can stay. So again, one of the reasons that Frost was probably as popular in his life is because many people misread him. We're going to look at, two roads diverged in a wood today, and I'm going to teach you or show you more probably the intention behind the poem. So now you won't be you can roll your eyes at all your graduation speeches when people misquote Frost. This is a letter to John Bartlett by Frost, where he's explaining the sound of sense, right? That sort of sound, a sense of stillness and simplicity in his poem as a way of revealing this very sort of unnerving and dangerous fear and anxiety inducing emptiness that he feels. I always think of the Zombies when I teach Frost, and maybe that's weird. It's the band from the 60s, but they have these really beautiful, like sweet melodies that you almost don't listen to the words, but if you listen to the words, they're really like terrifying. They're explaining sort of death and loss, and we don't ever hear that because they're presented in this sort of very sweet, very innocent tone and presentation. And so we're sitting there and we're dancing, we're elated by what we hear, but then when we listen, oh, we could become so much more horrified. um Frost writes, I alone of English writers have conscientiously set myself up to make music out of what I have to call the sound of sense. As in much prose that is supposed to pass muster, but makes very dull reading. And the sound of sense without sense, as in Alice in Wonderland, makes anything but dull reading. The best place to get the abstract sound of sense is from voices behind a door that cuts off the words. Now, it is possible to have sense without the sound of sense, as is much prose that is supposed to pass the muster. So what he's getting at here, right, that we're able to create and to state these phrases. We're able to get at these understandings. But what Frost is trying to do is to create the essence of that approachable atmosphere, right? The best place to get the abstract sound of sense is from voices behind a door that cuts off the words. So it's not necessarily the sound of sense isn't necessarily what is being stated, but the feeling that it encompasses. He's trying to sort of like lull us into a false state of acceptance so that we can sort of deal with what he's presenting us with. Because what he's presenting us with is really, really horrific. It's very, very anxiety inducing, but he's trying to do it in a way that it doesn't frighten the reader. Instead, they feel it naturally, right? They see it becoming part of them naturally. And so we accept it because we allow the words to come. Those sounds are summoned by the audible imagination. Sorry, I always drink a lot of water in the afternoon. And they must be positive, strong, and definitely and unmistakably indicated by the context. The reader must be at no loss to give his voice the posture proper to the sentence. The simple declarative sentence used in making a plain statement is one sound. But Lord love ye, it mustn't be worked to death. It should be natural. It should be imitative of common speech. It should be approachable. And yet underneath that sort of sense of familiarity, there is a truth, an anxiety, a vulnerability, a questioning that is complex. We need not make our art difficult to approach. We'll get to the same idea when we get to Hemingway, right? That art need not be hard. Art does not need to be wholly strange and avant-garde, right? Art needs to be the sense of familiarity so that we have something that we can hang on to. This is very much what we see in Frost. He is writing about this sort of New England landscape that he's familiar with. Frost is also comes from a very poor upbringing. There's a sort of guilt in Frost because Frost comes from a long line of blue collar workers, right? He comes from a long line of poverty who had to work for anything that they had. And then here comes Frost, who becomes Harvard educated. And he experiences a great deal of guilt because he is able to afford his life on the act of writing poetry. It's one of the reasons when we see objects in Frost, they are not being used to their fullest extent because he feels that he's so hyper aware of the privilege that he's been given to be a poet versus to be a farmer or a groundskeeper, that we see this pull between Frost and the objects in Frost's poem. But nothing in his poems are overly complicated. He keeps the language, he keeps the form, he keeps the art familiar so we can understand and rely on that sense of familiarity. The sound of, but Lord love ye, it mustn't be worked to death. We can't make it overly complicated. It is against the law of nature that whole poems should be written in it. If they are written, they won't be read. The sound of sense, then. You get that. It is the abstract vitality of our speech. It is pure sound, pure form. One who concerns himself with it more than the subject is an artist. But remember, we are still talking merely of the raw material of poetry. An ear, an appetite of these sounds of sense is the first qualification of a writer, be it of prose or verse. The abstract vitality. It is the complication without the sense of complication. We can't make everything simplistic and declarative because then it's boring. But we also can't stand so much in the way of simplicity that we distance ourselves from what we were trying to get at. It must be art, but it also must be art in the familiar. So now we're going to listen to Birches. And that's on page 231 for those of you who are wanting to follow along and mark up your book.
When I see birches bent to left and right across the lines of straighter, darker trees, I like to think some boy's been swinging them. But swinging doesn't bend them down to stay as ice storms do. Often you must have seen them loaded with ice a sunny winter morning after a rain. They click upon themselves as the breeze rises and turn many-colored as the stir cracks and crazes their enamel. Soon the sun's warmth makes them shed crystal shells, shattering and avalanching on the snow crust. Such heaps of broken glass to sweep away, you'd think the inner dome of heaven had fallen. They are dragged to the withered bracken by the load, and they seem not to break. Though once they're bowed so low for long, they never right themselves. You may see their trunks arching in the woods years afterward, trailing their leaves on the ground like girls on hands and knees that throw their hair before them over their heads to dry in the sun. But I was going to say, when truth broke in with all her matter of fact about the ice storm, I should prefer to have had some boy bend them as he went out or in to fetch the cows, some boy too far from town to learn baseball, whose only play was what he found himself, summer or winter, and could play alone. One by one, he subdued his father's trees by writing them down over and over again until he took the stiffness out of them, and not one but hung limp. Not one was left for him to conquer. He learned all there was to learn about not launching out too soon and so not carrying the tree away clear to the ground. He always kept his poise to the top branches, climbing carefully with the same pains you used to fill a cup up to the brim and even above the brim. Then he flung outward, feet first with a swish, kicking his way down through the air to the ground. So was I once myself a swinger of birches, and so I dream of going back to be. It's when I'm weary of considerations, and life is too much like a pathless wood where your face burns and tickles with the cobwebs broken across it, and one eye is weeping from a twig's having lashed across it open. I'd like to get away from earth a while, and then come back to it and begin over. May no fate willfully misunderstand me and half grant what I wish and snatch me away not to return. Earth's the right place for love. I don't know where it's likely to go better. I'd like to go by climbing a birch tree and climb black branches up a snow-white trunk toward heaven till the tree could bear no more, but dipped its top and set me down again. That would be good both going and coming back. One could do worse than be a swinger of birches. When I see birches bent to left.
I'm gonna get this. So let's look at this poem. When I see birches bend to the left and right across the line, straighter, darker trees, I like to think of some boys been swinging them, but swinging doesn't bend them down to stay as ice storms do. So again, we're sort of there's this sort of tension between nature and man, right? Where nature has this sort of ultimate authority or fate, we could even go as far to say, over the appearance of man, because the snowstorms can bend the birch more than any man could bend the birch. And the birch is being used metaphorically to refer to the transition we experience through life, right? We at first stand tall and strong, but if we look here at about lines 14, you'd think the inner dome of heaven had fallen. They are dragged to the withered bracken by the load, and they seem not to break, though once they are bowed so low for long, they never right themselves. You may see their trunks arching in the woods years afterwards, trailing their leaves on the ground like girls' hands and knees that throw their hair before them over their head to dry in the sun. There's this sort of that what we are given or what we experience in life is so heavy and weighted. Our experiences shape and bend and alter us to a state that we can never, though once they are bowed so low for long, they never right themselves. We can never overcome or become what we once were. We have that nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold. That's that same idea in this poem, right? Because we can never write ourselves again. We lose that green, we lose that innocence of our individuality. We'll keep going down, and we're about at line 20, right? But I was going to say, when truth broke in with all her matter of fact about the ice storms, I should prefer to have some boy bend them as he went out in to fetch the cows, right? So he's wanting it to, that man has more power, or that the boy has more power over his fate, over his destiny. Oh, but that's sort of this imagined truth, right? Because look, truth here. But I was going to say, when truth broke in, I should prefer to have some boy bend them. And truth here is capitalized. This is truth. I would say that I would prefer to have some boy bend them, but I know that the boy has no real impact on what he sees and he's experiencing. I'll take you quickly to mowing. We're not going to go over all of mowing, but there's a line in mowing I think that is really important, right? Perhaps it was something about the heat of the sun. And this is the mowing. I'm on lines 4. That's where I'm starting. Perhaps it is something about the heat of the sun, something perhaps about the lack of sound, and that was why it whispered and did not speak. It was no dream of the gift of idle hours, or easy gold at the hand or fay or elf. Anything more than the truth would have seemed too weak, right? Anything more than the truth would have seemed too weak. To the earnest love laid a swall and rose. Oops, turn the page, too many pages. Not without feeble pointed spikes of flowers. My long scythe whispered and left the hay to make. So we see that it's that we have this desire to think we have more control over what we're experiencing than what we really do. How is it? Oh, okay. That went away. My computer's been plugged in. But here we are. You're going to see the reality that I face, which is my battle with technology. Okay, we're plugged in and we're charging. Let's come back. I like to think I have more control over the computer, but I don't. I have to admit that fate carries more control. But so now let's go back to Birch's, right? And again, this is probably one of his more misread poems, right? Because there is this sort of like, again, it's that sound of sense, the simplicity in his voice and of his sort of matter of fact, plain use of in style. But he's getting at, though once they are bowed for so long, they never right themselves. But I was going to say, when truth broke in with all her matter of fact about the ice storm, I should prefer to have some boy bend them as he went out in to fetch the cows, some boy too far from town to learn baseball, whose only play was the what he found himself, summer or winter, and could play alone. One by one he subdued his father's trees by riding them down over and over again until he took the stiffness out of them, and not one but hung limp, Not one was left for him to conquer. The poem is the story of the child, right? Of the boy now. And so we have the boy who is isolated, who's having to learn alone. And then we have the appearance of another figure, which is the absent father. For Frost, there is no God. For him, the absent father is God. And we are, in a sense, the boy. He learned, and there's this play that he can't ever fully become anything or know anything because he's always having to do it alone. He's having to play alone, to learn alone, to develop alone, and so he begins to conquer the birch trees, and he climbs them, he explores them, he subdues them. He learned all there was to learn about not launching out too soon, and so not carrying the tree away clear to the ground. He always kept his poise to the top branches, climbing carefully with the same pains you use to fill a cup, up to the brim and even above the brim. So I was once myself a swinger of birches, and so I dream of going back to be. It's when I'm weary of considerations, and life is too much like a pathless wood where your face burns and tickles with the cobwebs broken across it, and one eye is weeping from a twig's having lashed across it open. I'd like to get away from earth for a while, and then come back to it and begin over. Frost is looking back on his life and he's reflecting, right? I was once too this young and green boy who trotted out in the woods alone and swang on the birches, overcame, explored. But now, so was I once myself a swinger. And so I dream of going back to be. It's when I'm weary of considerations, when I'm tired of the appearance of choice. And I realize that life is like a pathless wood where your face burns and tickles with the cobweb, where we're constantly in confronting these experiences that mold us, that bend us down to almost the breaking point. And it's this like constant sort of combating of fate, of the natural world, of this these moments, these experiences that we have that shape us, that bend us down into this new brokenness. And so he wants to get away from Earth for a while. I mean, that's a daring statement. And then come back to it and begin over. May no fate willfully misunderstand me. I'm not wanting to die. Instead, I'm wanting to get away for a moment, to rest for a moment, to not have to fight for a moment, and then come back and be green again. And maybe in that becoming green, embark on a new direction again. It's not a longing to have purpose or sense of direction or to change, but instead just a longing to come back before the bending. Earth's the right place for love. May no fate willfully misunderstand me and half grant what I wish and snatch me away, not to return. I don't long to die. Or at least I can't go there right now. Earth is the right place for love. I don't know where it's likely to go better. I'd like to go by climbing a birch tree and climb black branches up a snow-white trunk toward heaven, till the tree could bear me no more, but dipped its top and set me down again. That would be good, both going and coming back. One could do worse than be a swinger of birches. There's a real fear of death in frost. Because again, there is no God in frost, so to die is to be done. And so what is he's longing for instead? This playful return that he could explore. We're going to look now at Home Burial, probably the longest Frost poem that we've read. Here we are. And we're just going to follow along with the reading. I couldn't find a copy of Frost reading this one, so we're listening to someone else read it, and he does a great job, right? But sometimes his voices are a little bit too much.
Home burial. He saw her from the bottom of the stairs. Before she saw him, she was starting down, looking back over her shoulder at some fear. She took a doubtful step and then undid it. To raise herself and look again, he spoke, advancing toward her. What is it you see? From up there always, for I want to know. She turned and sank upon her skirts at that, and her face changed from terrified to dull. He said to gain time, What is it you see? Mounting until she cowered under him. I will find out now, you must tell me, dear. She in her place refused him any help. With the least stiffening of her neck and silence, she let him look, sure that he wouldn't see. Blind creature, and a while he didn't see. But at last he murmured, Oh, and again, Oh. What is it? What? She said. Just that I see. You don't, she challenged. Tell me what it is. The wonder is I didn't see it at once. I never noticed it from here before. I must be wonted to it. That's the reason. The little graveyard where my people are. So small, the window frames the whole of it. Not so much larger than a bedroom, is it? There are 3 stones of slate and 1 of marble. Broad-shouldered little slabs there in the sunlight. On the side hill, we haven't to mind those. But I understand. It is not the stones, but the child's mound. Don't, don't, she cried. She withdrew, shrinking from beneath his arm that rested on the banister, and slid downstairs and turned on him with such a daunting look. She said twice over before he knew himself, "Can't a man speak of his own child he's lost?" "Not you. Oh, where's my hat? Oh, I don't need it. I must get out of here. I must get air. I don't know rightly where any man can." "Amy, don't go to someone else this time. Listen to me. I won't come down the stairs." He sat and fixed his chin between his fists. "There's something I should like to ask you, dear." "You don't know how to ask it?" "Help me then." Her fingers moved the latch for all reply. "My words are nearly always an offense. I don't know how to speak of anything so as to please you, but I might be taught. I should suppose, I can't say I see how, a man must partly give up being a man. With women folk, we could have some arrangement by which I'd bind myself to keep hands off. Anything special you're a mind to name, though I don't like such things twixt those that love. Two that don't love can't live together without them, but two that do can't live together with them." She moved the latch a little. Don't go. Don't carry it to someone else this time. Tell me about it, if it's something human. Let me into your grief. I'm not so much unlike other folk as yours standing there. A part would make me out. Give me my chance. I do think, though, you overdo it a little. What was it brought you up to think it the thing? To take your mother, loss of a first child, so inconsolably in the face of love, you'd think his memory might be satisfied. There you go sneering now. I'm not. You make me angry. I'll come down to you. God, what a woman. And it's come to this. A man can't speak of his own child that's dead. You can't because you don't know how to speak. If you had any feelings, you that dug with your own hand, how could you? His little grave. I saw you from the very window there, making the gravel leap and leap in air, leap up like that, and land so lightly, and roll back down the mound beside the hole. I thought, who is that man? I didn't know you. And I crept down the stairs and up the stairs to look again, and still your spade kept lifting. Then you came in. I heard your rumbling voice out in the kitchen, and I don't know why, but I went too near to see with my own eyes. You could sit there with the stains on your shoes of the fresh earth from your own baby's grave, and talk about your every concerns. You had stood the spade up against the wall, outside there in the entry, for I saw it. I shall laugh the worst laugh I ever laughed. I'm cursed. God, if I don't believe I'm cursed. I can repeat the very words you were saying. 3 foggy mornings and 1 rainy day, You'll rot the best birch fence a man can build. Think of it, talk like that at such a time. How long it takes a birch to rot, to do with was in the darkened parlor. You couldn't care. The nearest friends can go. With anyone to death come so far short, they might as well not try to go at all. No, from the time when one is sick to death, one is alone, and he dies more alone. Friends make pretense of following to the grave, but before one is in it, their minds are turned, and making the best of their way back to life, and living people, and things they understand. But the world's evil. I won't have grief so, if I can change it. Oh, I won't. There, you have said it all, and you feel better. You won't go now. You're crying. Close the door. The heart's gone out of it. Why keep it up? Amy, there's someone coming down the road. You think the talk is all? I must go. Somewhere out of this house. How can I make you? If you do, she was opening the door wider. Where do you mean to go? First tell me that. I'll follow and bring you back by force. I will.
To this New England poor agricultural community. And we're seeing the simplicity and stillness, and also sort of the inescapable life and perspective that they experience because of their station in life. Home burial, we know, is about somebody who comes from a lower income family. So we know too at the beginning that we're going to be looking at a family's graveyard, right? That it's generational, right? So we know too that generationally this land has been owned and a part of this family's life for generations. I've already said that, and it appears to be 3 generations. I want to bring us first to lines. When we look at the beginning of the poem, we're seeing that there is a husband who's speaking down to his wife at the bottom of the stairs. He is asking her to come up to him. He's asking her to reveal to him, to come up to him, to stay with him. And she's standing beneath him at the foot of the stairs. She's sort of trapped in this inescapable emotional experience. And their placement is important, right? Because the husband has a sense of a need to move on, or a need to suppress and to continue without, still emotionally devastated by it, but he can't allow himself to become encased in it. He can't allow himself the freedom to fully mourn. He has to continue forward. Whereas she can't move past this sort of isolation, this loneliness. So he's begging her to come up to him, and she's wanting him to come down to her. But she knows that it there's a sense of surrender in her to know that he will never be able to give to her fully what she needs, which is to lose himself in this time, in this mourning period. And so we find here where begin first at we'll start first at line 12, I think. I will find out now. I will find out now. You must tell me, dear. We'll start a little early. What is it you see from up there always? For I want to know. And then I will find out now. You must tell me, dear. She in her place refused him any help. With the least stiffening of her neck of silence, she let him look, sure that he wouldn't see, blind creature, and while he didn't see. But at last he murmured, oh. And again, oh. She cannot acknowledge his this departure. What is it? What? She said. Just that I see. You don't, she challenged. Tell me what it is. The wonder is I didn't see it at once. I never noticed it from here before. I must be wantin' to it. That's the reason. The little graveyard where my people are. So small the window frames the whole of it. Not so much larger than a bedroom, is it? The wife can't go to him because she can't look at what's beyond, what's outside of him. She's hyper aware of it. For him, I mustn't be wanting to it. That's the reason. This is pattern. This is practice. This is mundane. This is ordinary. Wanton. So small the window frames the whole of it. Not much larger than a bedroom, is it? Um, and again, the bedroom there is a very important symbol, right? Because it's small, it's intimate, and there's also, from their bedroom has come death. There are 3 stones of slate and 1 of marble, 1-shouldered little slabs there in the sunlight on the side hill. We haven't to mind those, but I understand it is not the stones, but the child's mound. Don't, she cried. She can't hear it, right? He's beginning to speak on the grave itself, the child's mound. That's how we know that it's the death of their child, is when we're first being made aware of where the tension or the disconnect is between the two of them. As we begin to filling their we're beginning to see the splintering. We're beginning to see the fraying. We'll skip down, right? Notice too that we're introduced to one of the tools of Frost that can't be used, right? Look at line 70. You can't because you don't know how to speak. If you had any feelings, you that dug with your own hands, how could you, his little grave? I saw you from that very window there, making the gravel leap in air, leap up like that, and land so lightly and roll back down the mound beside the hole. I thought, who is that man? I don't know you. And I crept downstairs and up the stairs. Then you came in. I heard your rumbling voice out in the kitchen, and I don't know why. but I went nearer to see with my own eyes. You could sit there with the stains on your shoes of the fresh earth from your own baby's grave and talk about your everyday concerns. You had stood the spade up against the wall outside there in the entry, for I saw it. The tool can't be used. The tool is broken. I shall laugh the worst laugh I ever laughed. I'm cursed, God, if I don't believe I'm cursed. There's this practicality to the husband. There's this desire to continue forward. And we know too that it's that the generations have led up to this point with the wife. And when a parent loses their child, they lose their immortality. There is no God in Frost. And so the death of a child is the death of his immortality, right? Because the child then would inherit the land, and the child would then marry, and the child would then continue on this generation or lineage for forever. I mean, is sort of the ideal that we're getting here, right? There's also a sense too that maybe the family was once of a better income, right? One of marble, then three of slate. So one that cost money, and then three that didn't, that are cheaper, more affordable, practical. And then lastly, that the child's mound is without a headstone. And then the last thing that I want to point out to us, right, is the wife is looking at the husband here. And this shows this is probably the clearest sort of, for me, the clearest reveal that she is upset that in a sense she feels that he has moved on too fully, that it's like the child never mattered, but he has. It's that the husband in his own way is mourning the loss of his child, right? He had to bury him. His hands dug the earth. He is the one who put the child to rest. She saw that as him just going about and doing what needed to be done next. But then we come to this section, and I'm on 95, line 95. I can repeat the very words you were saying. 3 foggy mornings and 1 rainy day will rot the best birch fence a man can build. Think of it. Talk like that at such a time. What had how long it takes a birch to rot to do with what was in the darkened parlor. You couldn't dare. She's seeing this as him emotionally detaching, right? Or being emotionally blind or dead or unaffected by it. But for him, he's acknowledging his inability to create anything that lasts. Right? It's the best that a man can build. What does a man build? A man builds a family. And he can't build a fence to protect his own. There's that sense of a feeling of failure. And then we get into that you die alone, right? There's this constant, we pretend that relationships matter, we pretend that connections matter, but when you die alone. And so there's the mother's feeling of abandonment, feeling that she abandoned him because she's still living. beautiful poem. One that, we can spend a great deal of time on, but we don't have that kind of time. We're going to end now with the most famous poem by Frost. Not most famous, but probably the most quoted, or at least the most perhaps misquoted poem by Frost. This is on 230. And again, when we go from what Lionel Trilling was saying about how, sorry, I'm going to have a bite of something I haven't eaten yet. When we go from Frost as a terrifying poet, as opposed to this sort of clean pastoral poet, and we read Two Roads Taken, right? We as Americans want to embrace the notion of nonconformity, of rebellion, right? We want to believe that that sense of going against the tide matters and has real impact on us. So when we read The Road Not Taken, two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both. And be one traveler long I stood, and looked down one as far as I could, to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though as for that passing there, had worn them really both the same. And both that morning equally lay, in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day. Yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. All right. Right. So I took the road less traveled by, and it's made all the difference. Right. And so we, sort of the American collective unconscious, we hear that and we're like, yeah, it did make all the difference. You've made the change. You've made it happen for yourself. You're doing it, right? Maybe that's not the intention that Frost had for this poem. So, two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both. And be one traveler long I stood, and looked down one as far as I could, to where it bent in the aftergrowth. So we're looking at this and we're knowing that it's an autumnal, or it's an autumn poem, right? Because the wood is yellow, right? So two roads diverged in a yellow woods. And sorry I could not travel both. Why can he not travel both? Because we can only make one choice. And then this choice is the path in which we're on. So, and be one traveler, long I stood, and looked down one as far as I could, to where it bent in the aftergrowth. We're imagining perhaps, sorry I could not travel both, and be one traveler, long I stood. So we are investigating one road very thoroughly. I looked down it as far as I could. I investigated it. I wanted to know it. I'm trying to make a choice, to where it bent in the undergrowth. I followed it as far as the eye could see. And then the next stanza, then took the other as just as fair. We don't explore that path. We just look at it. And having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear, though as for that time, that the passing there had worn them really both the same. So when we read this poem, we see that we first look at the other path for a long time. We investigate that path, and then we just make a choice. We just choose the other path, right? So choice is irrelevant in this poem because we just chose the other one. Why not? And then we see, and having perhaps the better claim because it was grassy and wanted wear, though as for the passing there had worn them really both the same. We see that they're the same path, right? But before we're like, oh well, this path hasn't been traveled. But really, we're seeing here that the two paths are almost identical, though as for the passing there had worn them really both the same. And both that morning equally lay, and leaves no step had trodden black. Both paths had been unexplored, because we reached this point of choice, and we hadn't gone down one or the other. Before, we think that this is the path that's less explored. This is the path that's least adventured. So I chose to take that path. I chose to be a nonconformist. I chose to rebel. But both that morning equally lay, and leaves no step had trodden black, which is when we walk on leaves, freshly fallen leaves. They change color. We bruise them. Oh, I kept the first for another day. Yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I'll do it some other time. The problem, though, is that we can never actually return to this state in the woods, right? That's why in the Swinger of Birches, we want to come back to this point. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence, right? And it's not, I shall be telling this with vigor. I shall be telling this with pride. Instead, it's, I will be telling this with a sigh. Because we're in autumn, right? Spring is new life. Spring is birth. Spring is renewal. Summer is age and living, right? It's the green that we can no longer hold on to. And autumn is the beginning of the decline. It's the step towards death. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by. And that has made all the difference. So before we're in autumn, we're approaching, and now here I am in the future, right? Reflecting back on my life. And it's not the, oh, look, I took the road less traveled by and it made all the difference. It's this future, we're acknowledging that in the future I will look back at this moment, or I will look back at these divergent woods, divergent paths, and I will remember it, or I will retell it as better than it was. Because we can never return. Right? There's the phrase, you can never step into the same river twice. So even if I come to a similar point in my venture, I still didn't take this choice. I was still bound to this fate. But I will remember it as being significant. when really it was just I chose the road less traveled by. So now we're transitioning into Hughes, right? This is Of Modern Poetry by Wallace Stevens. And so I wanted to use this as we transition, because Frost is very much sort of the old head, the familiar poetic voice, but he's doing something very, very sort of high modern and avant-garde and that sort of simplicity. There's a lot of connections that we can make with Hughes and with Frost and Hemingway, and Frost and Faulkner almost, right? So there's that sense of high modernism, and we're about to get into Langston Hughes, and we have a tendency when we talk about Langston Hughes to talk about him as if he was solely just a member of the Harlem Renaissance. And we look at the Harlem Renaissance as if it's almost disconnected from what the other modernists are doing, right? High art and modernism, and then, the Harlem Renaissance. And so I do appreciate it as a sort of a subcategory of modernism. But what I want to focus on more today is how it is modernism, right? And how what these authors are doing is they are creating this sense of artistic exploration that deals with and confronts or alleviates the anxiety of purposelessness, right? It's just that there's also has a tendency to be sort of a political leaning in the Harlem Renaissance writers, because they're having to deal with being Black in America. But this is an ars poetic poem written by Wallace Stevens titled Of Modern Poetry. The poem of the mind is the act of finding what will suffice. Ars poetic means a poem about the act or the art of writing poetry. The poem of the mind in the act of finding what will suffice. It has not always had to find. The scene was set, it repeated what was in the script. Then the theater was changed to something else. The past was a souvenir. So first, what he's doing is he's talking about the shift we see in poetry, right? We're becoming more and more formless in a sense, right? That we're not adhering to form just because we would be adhering to form. So we're no longer, if that form sort of supersedes emotion, right? And that's what he's arguing here is what poetry used to be, right? That the scene was set, it repeated what was in the script. So perhaps the ideas were new or different, but they weren't, they were patterned in a sense. And then the theater was changed to something else. Its past was a souvenir. Of modern poet. It has to be, and notice too that the past was a souvenir, right? And a souvenir is something that's treasurable, it's something that's beautiful, it's something that we hold on to, that we use, that we can look back to with fondness, right? But it's not the past was archaic or the past was outdated. The past was a souvenir. And we're going to see that again. We talked about that briefly when we talked about Eliot. We'll see that again when we get into this passage. It has to be living to learn the speech of the place. It has to face the men of the time and meet the women of the time. It has to think about war and to find what will suffice. It has to construct a new stage. It has to be on that stage. And like an insatiable actor, slowly and with meditation, speak words about the ear, in the delicatest ear of the mind, repeat exactly that which it wants to hear, at the sound of which an invisible audience listens. So first off, we're talking about it has to meet the people of the speech of the place. We're becoming simplistic. We're no longer altering speech to fit form. We're using the speech of commoners, right? We're not only writing poems to kings and queens and dames and ladies and all that stuff. And it has to face the men of the time. Well, that's what Hughes, in a sense, is making us do. He's making us face the men of the time, which is all men, right? And then Stevens goes even a step further and says it has to meet the women of the time. Which is interesting because we're using the theater as sort of the metaphor to get us to this understanding of what of modern poetry would be, to understand it. And he's using the theater, which again we has a strong connection to poetry, especially in the past. But we have to meet the women of the time. In the theater, we know that women didn't even used to play, that women weren't even allowed to play women in plays, that they were played by men. That's how omitted from this conversation women's voices have a tendency to be. And then it has to think about war. It has to think about it has to rebuild a stage. It doesn't have form anymore. And then it has to act on that stage. And no longer is the poet isn't necessarily as predominant of a character in modern culture, right? That it has to do it to the most delicatest ear. Repeat exactly which it wants to hear, at the sound of which an invisible audience listens. I have to use this language, these words, which are ineffective at being able to convey what I am trying to say. Right? This is where the essay Black comes into play, because we see that Black is deconstructed so much so that our understanding of Black is based on our understanding of it as opposite of white. That he deconstructs that binary to show us that Black is white and white is Black. And so we have to use language to try and get us to a sense of understanding, even though language is a broken and failed vehicle. It has to be able to reach the invisible audience in an emotion as of two people, as of two emotions becoming one. I'm giving you these words. I'm giving you this art, not so that you can just appreciate it, not just so that you can read it, but so that you can experience it, so that you can feel it, so that you can be changed by it. The actor is a metaphysician in the dark, twanging an instrument, twanging a wiry string that gives sounds passing through sudden brightnesses, wholly containing the mind, below which it cannot descend, beyond which it has no will to rise. It must be the finding of a satisfaction. It must be the finding of a satisfaction, of an emotional release, of a point of arrival, and maybe of a man skating, a woman dancing, a woman combing. The poem is the act of the mind. So now we get into Hughes. We're going to look at I2. Later on, we'll visit The Negro Speaks of Rivers, The Weary Blues, and then Mulatto. This is from The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain, an essay written by Hughes. Here he writes, but then there are the low-down folks, the so-called common element, and they are the majority. May the Lord be praised. The people who have their hip of gin and on Saturday nights and are too important to themselves or the community, or too well fed, or too learned to watch the lazy world go round. They live in 7th Street in Washington, or on State Street and in Chicago, and they do not particularly care whether they are like white folks or anybody else. Their joy runs bang into ecstasy. Their religion soars to a shout. Work maybe a little today, rest a little tomorrow. Play a while, sing a while. Oh, let's dance. These common people are not afraid of spirituals, as for a long time their more intellectual brethren were, and jazz is their child. They furnished a wealth of colorful, distinctive material for any artist because they still hold their own individuality in the face of American standardization. Already we're coming to that sense of rebellion, that sense of nonconformity. And perhaps these common people will give to the world its truly great Negro artist, the one who is not afraid to be himself, whereas the better class would tell the artist what to do. The people at least let him alone when he does appear. And they are not ashamed of him if they know he exists at all, and they accept what beauty is their own without question. Hughes is very much aware that he wants to become a figurehead. He wants to be that artist that creates this sort of shift. He wants to be this memorable figure that reveals the beauty of his community, the art of his community. He wants to become that representative. He wants to create that pathway to understanding. He wants to be that voice. And so we see that already being referenced here, right? We see that Hughes has this desire to become this character. I too sing America. I too. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow, I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am American. Hughes here is celebrating himself. There's so many connections that we can make to Whitman when we read Hughes, especially in The Negro Speaks of Rivers, right? But I too sing America. I too, what is it? Song of Myself, right? In Song of Myself, right? Whitman begins, I celebrate myself and I sing myself, and what I will assume you will. I too sing America. Melody, cadence, sound is important to Hughes. He's, in a sense, trying to recreate the essence of jazz in poetry. Right? That feeling of the bending, that feeling of the rebellion, that feeling of the horn crying out from beyond the depths, right? I am the darker brother. You used to be ashamed of me. And so you hid me. But I've been growing stronger. I've been nurturing the soul. I've been preparing. And now I'm here and I'm well fed, I'm strong, I'm mighty, I'm beautiful, and you will not ignore me. The reckoning is to come. And that's what Hughes is getting at. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I, too, am American and am America. This is definitely sort of one of his more direct, more politically driven poems, right? But we see him here offering up himself or creating a poem from that first person perspective that is that figure, that is that undeniable, that is the welcoming of the feasts. This is another essay that Hughes had written titled Jazz and Communication. You can start anywhere, jazz as communication, since it's a circle and you yourself are the dot in the middle. You, me. For example, I'll start with the blues. I'm not a Southerner. I never worked on a levee. I hardly ever saw a cotton field except from the highway, but women behave the same on Park Avenue as they do on the levee. When you've got hold of one part of them and the other part escapes you, that's the blues. Hughes wants to tap into this sort of sense of existence, of experience, and he wants to create it in a way that we can all come to that understanding, right? No matter what, he's preparing this sort of orchestral, sound-driven, paced poem that encompasses us. A few more years and rock and roll will no doubt be washed back, half forgotten, into the sea of jazz. Jazz is a great big sea. It washes up all kinds of fish and shells and spum and waves with a steady old beat or offbeat. And Louis Armstrong, must be getting old if he thinks JJ and Kai and even Elvis didn't come out of the same sea he came out of too. Some water has chlorine in it and some doesn't. There are all kinds of water. There's salt water and Saratoga water and Vichy water and quinine water and Pluto water and Newport water, and it's all water. Throw it all in the sea, and throw it all in the sea, and the sea will keep on rolling along toward the shore and crashing and booming back into itself again. The sun pulls the moon pulls the sea. They also pull jazz and me. All American voice, all American music comes from this, as he's defining it here, jazz. To take that a step further, it's the blues, right? American rock and roll, the American standard of popular music is all based on a blues scale. It's foundational. So what he's saying is that you can bleach it, you can change it. We all come out of the same thing, the same mutt, but it's this sense of jazz, of sound, of experience that is American. And the American experience is jazz. It's just a different type of jazz. And so there's like power and freedom for Hughes here in the fact that he is the possessor of an authenticity, of an uncleaned form of language, of jazz, of experience. The sun pulls the moon pulls the sea. They also pull jazz and me. There's this natural connectedness that he experiences, and that we all, in a sense, experience. But maybe there's more directness in some in his perspective. Now, to wind it all up with you in the middle, jazz is only what you yourself get out of it. That's poetry. Louis' famous quote, or misquote probably, "Lady, if you have to ask what it is, you'll never know." Well, I wouldn't be so positive. The lady might know without being able to let loose the cry, to follow through. There's this, again, this sort of universal understanding of pain, of the experiences of which life bring upon us. And so she may not know that she knows. What is the job of the artist? What is the job of the poet? We talked about that the first day of class, right? That the job of the poet is to express what we society, we non-artists always have felt but cannot express. To reconnect us with that sense. So she knows what jazz is. She just doesn't know what jazz is. Without being able to let loose the cry, to follow through, the light up before the fuse blows out. To me, jazz is a montage of a dream deferred, a great big dream yet to come and always yet to become ultimately and finally true. Maybe in the next seminar or Saturday, Nat and Billy Strayhorn and Tony Scott and the others on the panel will tell us about it when they take up the future of jazz. That future is what you call pregnant. Potential papas and mamas of tomorrow's jazz are all known. And the papa and the mama, maybe both, are anonymous. But the child will communicate. Jazz is a heartbeat. Its heartbeat is yours. You will tell me its perspective when you get ready. Oh, maybe again there's a fascination with lineage that we see many of the Harlem Renaissance writers exploring, and we'll look at that when we get to Zora Neale Hurston, right? But maybe the papa and mama are anonymous, but the child will communicate. We, right? Maybe there's maybe that reference to the detachment of God, the papa and the mama, maybe both are anonymous, absent present. But we will communicate. We, the human experience. And that communication is not standardized. It is not pattern. It's jazz. The blues scale is built on quarter steps as opposed to standardized Western scale of music, which is built on half steps, right? And so there is this bending between the blues note, right? This bending between the tonal scale is where the truth is. That's the same thing that Eliot is talking about, right? Between the motion and the act falls the shadow. For Hughes, between the tone, between the standard falls the reality. He does not, Hughes is very much breaks all standard form and tradition. So much so that we could argue that he's one of the first people to adventure into sound poetry, which was poetry that was driven by a tonal scale, right? Because he has to find the right way to express this experience, which has for so long been neglected. and left out of the standard. We read the Baldwin essay, and we'll talk about Baldwin more next lecture, right? But he refuses the term dialect when he's defining Black English. He does that. He refuses dialect because dialect implies inferiority, a deviation from the standard. Hughes here is saying it's the celebration of that deviation is where the true communication comes from, and that's jazz. Jazz is a heartbeat. It's your heartbeat. It's your naturalness. It's your beauty. It's who you are. That is jazz. You will tell me about its perspectives when you get ready. When you get out of the way, that's what Emerson argues is the job of the poet, is that it should feel natural. It should come forth. And it's the poet's responsibility is solely just to get out of the way of it coming out. So we're going to listen to the Weary Blues. And I'm not going to explicate this because instead what I want you to do, right, is I want you to get into that same perspective or mentality that Whitman is calling for, right? Filter it through yourself. So you tell me what this means.
Good evening. Tonight, Mr. Langston Hughes, American poet, dramatist, novelist, lyricist, lecturer. He's in town to give a lecture at UBC, but he's here tonight to read poetry, his own poetry, to a jazz accompaniment. We have Alan Miller to interview him. We have Doug Parker and his band to provide the jazz, and Mr. Langston Hughes has his own accompaniment, his own introduction.
Suns are setting. This is what I'm gonna sing. Suns are setting. This is what I'm gonna sing. I feel the blues are coming. I wonder what the blues will bring. Roll in a drowsy, syncopated tune, rocking back and forth to a mellow croon. I heard a Negro play. Down on Lenox Avenue the other night, by the pale, dull pallor of a one-bulb light, he did a lazy sway. He did a lazy sway to the tune of those weary blues. With his ebony hands and each ivory key, he made that poor piano moan with melody. Oh, blues. Swaying to and fro on his rickety stool, he played that sad, raggy tune like a musical fool. Sweet blues, coming from a black man's soul. Oh, blues. In a deep song voice with a melancholy tone, I heard that Negro sing, that old piano moan. Ain't got nobody in all this world. Ain't got nobody but myself. I was going to quit my frowning and put my troubles on the shelf. Thump, thump, thump when he's put on the floor. He played a few chords, then he sang some more. I got the weary blues, I can't be satisfied. Got the weary blues, I can't be satisfied. I ain't happy no more. and I wish that I had died. Far into the night, crooned that tune. The stars went out, and so did the moon. The singer stopped playing and went to bed, while the weary blues echoed through his head. He slept like a rock, or a man that's dead.
All right, so now that we've listened to the Weary Blues, I want us to look at Song for a Dark Girl. Way down south in Dixie, break the heart of me, they hung my dark young lover to a crossroads tree. Way down south in Dixie, bruised body high in air, I asked the white Lord Jesus, what was the use of prayer? Way down south in Dixie, break the heart of me. Love is a naked shadow on a gnarled and naked tree. We again have that sense of that sense of sound being played with here in this poem, right? Way down south in Dixie. This is a common way of referring to or a popular minstrel song at that time. So Hughes is acknowledging the sound he's acknowledging sound in this poem. Way down south in Dixie, break the heart of me. Hughes doesn't tell us who the me is. right? Is the me the young woman, right? Is it this dark woman, this dark girl? Or is the me the reader? Or is the me the poet? Or is the me we don't know, and maybe it's all of them, right? They hung my dark young lover to a crossroads tree. Crossroads here is acknowledging again the crossroads of Christ, right? Are also acknowledging too this like catastrophe, this horror, can perhaps representative of a shift that we need to see, we need to pay homage to, we need to witness, right? Way down south in Dixie. This is an anaphora, right? It's used as, it's a refrain that's used to help enunciate or anticipate or reinforce the direction of the poem. It gives us a pattern that we can hang on to. Way down south in Dixie, bruised body high in air. Look too that we have break, bruised, right? There's this b, b, b sound again. It's a beat, it's a pattern, it's melodic. Way down south in Dixie, bruised body high in air. I asked the white Lord Jesus, what was the use of prayer? Again, the multiplicity of the image, bruised body high in air. Is it Christ's body? Is the man who was hung, is he being held as this Christ-like figure? I asked the white Lord Jesus, what was the use of prayer? We know that spirituality is very important to the Black community, right? Arguably one of the biggest reasons why we see so much advancement and change happened during the civil rights movement that we see here, right? That we're here, we're praying to the white Lord Jesus. What was the use of prayer? Way down south in Dixie, break the heart of me. Love is a naked shadow on a gnarled and naked tree. The nakedness here is getting to the bare truth. Coming to the strippedness, coming to the reality, coming to face the thing. Way down south in Dixie, break the heart of me. Love is a naked shadow on a gnarled and naked tree. We come back to the first essay that we started off at the beginning of the Hughes section, where he says, one of the most promising of the young Negro poets said to me once, I want to be a poet, not a Negro poet. Meaning, I believe I want to write like a white poet, meaning subconsciously, I would like to be a white poet, meaning behind that, I would like to be white. And I was sorry the young man said that. For no great poet has ever been afraid of being himself. And I doubt then that with his desire to run away spiritually from his race, this boy would ever be a great poet. But this is the mountain standing in the way of any true Negro art in America. This urge within the race toward whiteness, the desire to pour racial individuality into the mold of American standardization, and to be as little Negro as much American as possible. We talked earlier this semester about the Du Bois piece, the double consciousness, right? That he wishes to be both at once a Negro and an American. So that's where the divide comes. And so the plight of being an artist of color is that they have to. I mean, that's the in the racial mountain that they have to become. They have that you have to become comfortable with who you are, and you have to create. No artist can create something that is outside of their wheelhouse, would be a good metaphor for it, but so far outside of their experiences that they can't imagine anything within it. So here, what Hughes is looking at is that there is this sort of call to whitewash one's identity, to bleach one's experience. We see James Baldwin very directly addressing this in If Black English Isn't a Language, Then Tell Me What Is, right? That he cannot be fooled, right? He cannot have his authenticity and his experience taken away from him, because his experience is inherently the American experience. It's just the experience that we've been choosing to ignore for so long. And so Hughes is also he's very directly talking about Claude McKay in this passage too. And so I wanted us to look first at Mulatto by Claude McKay. Because I am the white man's son, his own bearing his bastard birthmark on my face, I will dispute his title to his throne, forever fight him for my rightful place. There is a searing hate within my soul, a hate that only kin can feel for kin. A hate that makes me vigorous and whole and spurs me on increasingly to win. Because I am my cruel father's child, my love of justice stirs me up to hate, a warring Ishmaelite unreconciled. When falls the hour, I shall not hesitate. Into my father's heart to plunge the knife, to gain the utmost freedom that is life. So McKay is using a very familiar standard American poetry form, right? Own, throne, face, place, soul, whole, kin, win, child, reconciled, hate, hesitate, knife, life, right? We'll look at another McKay poem, but this is actually referred to as a Shakespearean sonnet. He's writing in nearly perfect iambic pentameter. Because I am the white man's son. Because I am the white man's son, his own, bearing his bastard birthmark on my face. I will dispute his title to his throne, forever fight him for my rightful place. And what he's talking about here is, again, his being the child of the white man, right? Of the master. And And I love this line. I think about this line a lot whenever I come to it. A hate that only kin can feel for kin. Because the father will never acknowledge that the child is his. That birthmark is his light skin. It's the revealing of his lineage. But it's that hate that only kin can feel for kin, and that is such a real hate. No, because in a way, it's a self-hate, because we see so much of each other in our family, in our line, and so it's that that action, that sense of me. It's a self-hate in a sense, but it's also an external hate. I think it's one of, but we see too that it's somewhat indirect, in that he wants to a warring Ishmaelite unreconciled. When falls the hour, I shall not hesitate into my father's heart to plunge the knife, to gain the utmost freedom that is life. To overcome and to hold accountable the father for, quite honestly, the rape of his mother, right? The punishment for the crime. But again, it takes an astute. There's a lot of indirect. There's not. We're not getting at, or we're not picturing the act itself. And so there is this sort of forced conformity where we're wanting to use past forms. This is called classicism again, but we're reliant on the past to try and communicate the authenticity of what we see in the present. And perhaps there was the reason for, that the form itself shows the masterful powers and writing abilities of the poet, right? It is not easy to write a well-balanced modern sonnet that adheres to this standard form. And so McKay is showing the power of his words by showing his ability to create and to adhere to form. Hughes, however, is trying to get past this sort of white standard practice, and he wants to explore his own voice, his own perspective, and he wants to do it in his own form. Remember, the artist can never be self-hating, and the artist has to be authentic to himself. So then we look at Mulatto by Langston Hughes. And this is on page 837. And I'm going to change. I'm not comfortable reading some of what Hughes writes in this setting, so I do apologize if it lacks in sincerity. When we look at Mulatto by McKay, because I am the white man's son, his own. And then we look at I am your son, white man, which is how Mulatto opens. Georgia dusk and turpentine woods, one of the pillars of the temple fell. We're finding out where we are, right? We're here. We're at Georgia dawn. He's using this. It's a scene setting, right? He's calling out first, I am your son, white man, to the father. And I am your son, white man, Georgia dusk in the turpentine woods, One of the pillars of the temple fell. You are my son like hell. So we have now the invasion of the second voice, right? So we have one speaker. It's the son to the father, and now the father to the son. The moon over the turpentine woods, the southern night full of stars, great big yellow stars. What's a body but a toy? We're looking at that again. The first thing that we're doing is this is referred to as a call and response. It's very common in spirituals, right? I am your son, white man. You are my son like hell. And then we're being introduced to the scene. And then we're being immersed into the scene that we're going to get to. And we're seeing here the degrading of the woman's body. What's a body but a toy? Juicy bodies of black wenches, blue black against black fences. Oh, you little bastard boy, what's a body but a toy? Dehumanizing the mother. Moon over the turpentine woods, the southern night full of stars. The scent of pine wood stings the soft night air. What's the body of your mother? Silver moonlight everywhere. What's the body of your mother? Sharp pine scent in the evening air. We're looking at the two lovers of the white man right here. We have the silver moonlight everywhere. That's the white woman, the white mother's body. And then we have, what's the body of your mother? Sharp pine scent in the evening air. It's the encounter. That's how he relates to the black mother. A black night, a black joy, a little yellow bastard boy. That's the rape of his mother. And the result of it is the child. And he is of the yellow stars. He's of the scene, but he's also he's mixed. Nah, you ain't my brother. You ain't my brother. Not ever. Black ain't my brother. The southern night is full of stars, great big yellow stars. Oh, sweet as earth, dusk dark bodies give sweet birth to little yellow bastard boys. Get on back there in the night, you ain't white. The bright stars scatter everywhere, the pine wood scent in the evening air. A black night, a black joy. I am your son, white man, a little yellow bastard boy. The passage that we see here on the slide, great big yellow stars, what's a body but a toy, juicy bodies of black wenches, blue black against black fences. Oh, you little bastard boy, what's a body but a toy? That's the recounting of the rape of the mother. The scent of pine wood stings the soft night air. What's the body of your mother? Silver moonlight everywhere. Again, that call and response. What's the body of your mother? Silver moonlight everywhere. Untarnished, unchased, protected. What's the body of your mother? Sharp pine scent in the evening air. It's my mind to use as I choose to use when I choose to use it. So we see that what Hughes is doing compared to what, and both are beautiful poems. Both are masterful poems, but we do get that sense, that complete sense of adhering to any type of language that's not apologetic, because he's not apologetic in his poem, but he's it's acknowledging the true devastation of this experience. It's the thing itself. It's getting at it. It's direct. But so we're here now looking at the Harlem Renaissance. McKay is definitely one of the more prominent poets. I'm not going to have time to go over County Cullen, but he's a phenomenal poet as well. We will look at Zora Neale Hurston. So before we get into the next Claude McKay poem, we have to look at sonnets. And again, he's writing in the Shakespearean sonnet. A sonnet is any 14-line poem, right? We know that as soon as we're reading a sonnet, that we are dealing with some sort of traditional form, right? We have non-traditional sonnets, but the Shakespearean sonnet is probably one of the most traditional and utilized form of poetry in English verse, right? And the Shakespearean sonnet is it has a rhyme scheme of A B C D C D E F, and then it ends with the heroic couplet, the GG. It also usually the heroic couplet usually also symbolizes the turn in the sonnet, right? There's either a shift or there's sort of a summary of what the sonnet of a whole was about. They also are written in iambic pentameter, right? So an iambic pentameter is a metrical foot that consists of a stressed and of a unstressed and then stressed syllable. I am, right? That's an I am. Trochee is a metrical foot that consists of a stressed unstressed syllable, right? And so McKay very masterfully is utilizing meter and sound. The difference between McKay and Hughes is very much using sound as well and a playfulness with meter, but he's reinventing meter. He's reevaluating meter. What McKay is doing is referred to as classicism. And this is when you refer to the aesthetic or attitude of the past, right? Because you're wanting to sort of evoke that sense of harmony, that sense of purpose, that sense of idealism. Again, Eliot does this all the time. Eliot's Catholic, and so he's always sort of wanting to return to that point where he felt most connected to his faith, perhaps, right? He wants to return so that he can once again feel that sort of safety of purpose and sense of understanding of fate and direction in life. And so he uses a lot of imagery from that time. And he references a lot of works from earlier periods as a way of sort of grounding his work. Quote from Eliot, "We shall often find that not only the best, but the most individual parts of a poet's work may be those in which the dead poets, his ancestors, assert their immorality most vigorously. However, the relationship with modernism, with tradition, was complex. There were paradoxical, if not opposed, trends toward revolutionary and reactionary positions. Fear of the new and delight at the disappearance of the old. Creativity and despair, right? So if we look back at the McKay work, there is very much this sort of adherence to the past. And then when we look to the Hughes poem, it's avant-garde, it's relatively straightforward, but yet still indirect. There's a lot of different metaphor and allusion going on here. And then also just the language itself and the pattern of the language is again very much related to the Hughes style. There's a pacing, there's a heaviness, there's a beat to it, whereas McKay is using the beat of the past. So this tension just already exists in modernism, right? Do we want to make it new, or do we want to make it beholden? I don't know. This is America by Claude McKay. So I'm just going to briefly show you how you can explicate a poem, because this might come in handy for our final research paper. But the first thing that I would do is I would count the number of lines and the number of stanzas. There's one stanza. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 lines. So that means I'm working in some sort of sonnet. Now I'm going to have to look at the rhyme scheme. Although she feeds me bread of bitterness and sinks into my throat her tiger's tooth, stealing my breath of life, I will confess, I love this cultured hell that tests my youth. Her vigor flows like tides into my blood, giving me strength erect against her hate. Her bigness sweeps me, being like a flood, yet as a rebel fronts a king in state. I stand within her walls, with not a shred of terror, malice, not a word of jeer. Darkly I gaze into the days ahead, and see her might and granite wonder there. Beneath the touch of time's unerring hand, like priceless treasures sinking in the sand. Bitterness, confess, tooth, youth were an A, B rhyme scheme. Blood is C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F. Here and there, shred ahead. Jeer and there is one of the only ones where we that would be referred to as a slant rhyme, right? Jeer, there, but it's not a perfect rhyme, right? Hand and sand. And we can go through and we can do syllabic count, but I'm not going to do that today. Nobody got time for that. Just a good way of being able to identify meter is this. Although she feeds me bitterness and sinks into my throat her tiger's tooth. What we do when we have this, when we put our hand under our chin, is we're feeling where our mouth opens and closes. That's going to help us identify where the pattern of unstressed syllables are, right? But this is in iambic pentameter. And what he's doing is he's defining America as this sort of, what did I write about you, Claude McKay? Am I going to be able to find it? No. But so what he's doing here is he's writing about America as this sort of abusive lover, right? Her vigor flows like tides into my blood, giving me the strength erect against her hate. Whew. This is a very heated, sexualized, dangerous poem, but where our speaker is kind of acknowledging that he's enjoying it. I stand within her walls with not a shred of terror, malice, not a word of jeer. Darkly I gaze into the days ahead and see her might and granite wonders there, beneath the touch of time's unerring hand, like a priceless treasure sinking in the sand. I'm not going to closely analyze this poem, but you should, right? It's an intense work. One of the reasons, right, we see the huge difference in style between McKay and Hughes. But we also see that McKay, while he is working in a very classic, very standard form, he is definitely pushing boundaries for readers at this time. And so I say that because Hughes is a problematic figure that we have a tendency to ignore some of the problems that he creates in the Harlem Renaissance, especially when we look at Zora Neale Hurston, right? This is from In Search of My Mother's Garden. And it's a poetic theory essay that I've thoroughly it's a very well done argument by Alice Walker. Alice Walker is actually who finds and recreate or erects a gravestone for Zora Neale Hurston. And also, she's a modern American writer. She's probably most famous for writing The Color Purple. In Search of Our Mother's Garden. Or these grandmothers and mothers of ours were not saints, but artists, driven to a numb and bleeding madness by the springs of creativity in them, for which there was no release. They were creators who lived lives of spiritual waste, because they were not so rich in spirituality, which is the basis of art, that the strain of enduring their unused and unwanted talent drove them insane. Throwing away this spirituality was their pathetic attempt to lighten the soul, to await their own work-worn, sexually abused bodies could bear. When we read Sweat by Zora Neale Hurston, we're seeing that abused, gnarled, battered body that overcomes, right? And that abuse comes from both white society. It's why it's very important that she is a washerwoman, and she washes first the white clothes, and then she washes her clothes, or as she refers to it, the colored clothes. And so that's what we're investigating in that essay, as well as in The Gilded Six. Black women are called in folklore that so aptly identifies one's status in society, the mule of the world, because we have been handed the burdens that everyone else refused to carry. We have also been called matriarchs, superwomen, and mean and evil bitches, not to mention castrators and Sapphire's mama. When we have pled for understanding, our character has been distorted. When we have asked for simple caring, we have been handed empty, inspirational appellations, then stuck the farthest comer. When we have asked for love, we have been given children. In short, even our plainer gifts, our labors of fidelity and love, have been knocked down our throats. To be an artist and a Black woman, even today, lowers our status in any respect rather than raises it, and yet artists we will be. What we're getting at, and we'll talk about this a little bit more when we get into our discussion on binary opposition with the Baldwin essay, right? Is that in cultural studies, Derrida argues that we create a system in our language that has a tendency to privilege one word over another. They stand in opposition of one another. And so, as far as cultural studies are concerned, you would not want to have two lesser privileged labels against your identity. And that's what Walker is arguing here in this passage, is that Black women are arguably one of the most oppressed groups in our American society, or women of color, because you have two underprivileged terms used to identify who you are. It's a part of who you are, right? And so she's arguing that she comes up against that women artists of color come up against already these sorts of defining characteristics that shield or change the way in which we perceive the quality of their art or influence us. Notice too that she doesn't only use negative characteristics, right? It's matriarchs, superwomen, mean and evil bitches, right? So it's the both. It's the we're looking at again that sort of unstable um, classification of women's identities. Superwoman, mean and evil bitch. Um, and now she's getting at when we cry out about our experience, when we explore our truth, when we create art that inhabits our reality, we are ignored, we are scoffed, we are cast aside, we are not actually ever heard. And this is again one of the reasons why Langston Hughes is a relatively problematic figure during the Harlem Renaissance, because he essentially was the tastemaker of this movement. And Zora Neale Hurston and Hughes at the beginning of her career were very close, right? And then there's a huge falling out, especially in her usage of dialect. Hughes disagreed very much with the usage of dialect. And so he essentially casts her out, and she falls out of favor and becomes she ends up dying. She becomes so obscure and outside of, so forgotten by American culture, that she ends up dying in an unmarked grave in Eatonville, Florida, essentially almost washing away any of the art or lineage that she had created for herself from this time period. Alice Walker is acknowledging that, right? She's even quoting the mule of the world actually comes from Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. So the white men threw down the load and tell the black man to pick it up. He pick it up, and because he have to, but he don't tote it. He hand it to his women folks. The black woman is the mule of the world, so far as I can see. Right? And a big part of that Walker is getting at is because they were voiceless. Their experience was wholly almost ignored. And in a sense was not their own, because they were constantly denied any opportunity to overcome or to explore their own story, their own narrative. But I am not tragically colored. There is no great sorrow dammed up in my soul, nor lurking behind my eyes. I do not mind it at all. I do not belong to the sobbing school of Negrohood, who hold that nature somehow has given them a low down, dirty deal, and whose feelings are all about it. Even the helter-skelter skirmish that is my life, I have seen that the world is to the strong, regardless of a little pigmentation, more or less. No, I do not weep at the world. I am too busy sharpening my oyster knife. Very similar to the passage that we read from Hughes, right? Where he's stating that he um, um, where is he? What is he saying? That the desire to be a white American poet, or to be acceptable by white American poets, is a sort of self-hatred, is a sort of self-denial. We have that same sort of experience here, where Hurston is saying in her essay how it feels to be colored me, right? Where she's already sort of confronting a term and redefining that term to strengthen and invigorate her identity. Um, Somehow is always at my elbow. She's saying that I know that who I am, that I am not tragically colored. I rejoice in my identity. I rejoice in my richness and culture and body, and I am part of this community, and yet I am not solely defined by this community. I have a multiplicity of factors that define me. And then we get to this: someone is always at my elbow, reminding me that I am the granddaughter of slaves. It fails to register depression with me. Slavery is 60 years in the past. The operation was successful. The patient is doing well, thank you. The terrible struggle that made an American out of a potential slave said, on the line. The Reconstruction said, get set. And the generation before said, go. I am off to a flying start, and I must not halt in the stretch to look behind and weep. Slavery is the price I paid for civilization, and the choice was not with me. There is this sort of desire that we see in a lot of the Harlem Renaissance writers, is to create a lineage that is outside of slavery, right? Because again, if you're always sort of being defined by your oppression, we are that again is sort of an act of weakening a person's um, sort of self-assuredness and strength. And we see that for Hurston, she's saying that, no, I do not, that I have seen that the world is to the strong regardless of a little bit pigmentation or more or less. Um, Yes, that like that is a part of my history, that's a part of my lineage, but I am so much more beyond that, right? She becomes the cosmic Zora of infinite femininity. She becomes um this sort of like warrior Zora, that she is this again a multitude of identities. She is not just this one thing. She cannot be contained. Um, it's the same with Hughes, and the Negro speaks of rivers. I've known rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul is grown deep like the rivers. And then we have this list of rivers that is, in a sense, tracing his lineage, right? I bathed in the Euphrates. I was one of the first peoples. I built my hut near the Congo. I was a part of this civilization, this society. I looked upon the Nile and raised piers. I was one of the great inventors and constructors of human history. I heard the singing of the Mississippi, and I was there at freedom. Like, I'm so far more, so much more complicated than just this one factor that's being used to remind me of my oppression. Guided by my heritage of love, of beauty, and a respect for strength in search of my mother's garden, I found my own. And perhaps in Africa over 200 years ago, there was just such a mother. Perhaps her hut, perhaps Perhaps she painted vivid and daring decorations in oranges and yellows and greens on the walls of her hut. Perhaps she sang in a voice like Roberta Flack's sweetly over the compounds of her village. Perhaps she wove the most stunning mats or told the most ingenious stories of all the village storytellers. Perhaps she was herself a poet, though only her daughter's name is signed to the poems that we know. Again, referencing that the tribal languages of Africa are at this point oral tradition, right? So they would have never been written down until they were given the ability or the influence of written language was presented to them. But that didn't cheapen, right? That doesn't cheapen the quality or the beauty of the poetry, right? It makes it less permanent, which is why we have to explore to find it. Perhaps Phyllis Wheatley's mother was also an artist. Perhaps in more than Phyllis Wheatley's biological life is her mother's signature made clear. There's this, again, the Black women have been widely underrepresented in our art and in our American canon. And so it's this sort of resurfacing, this finding of a self-sureness, this uncovering of the lost Zora Neale Hurston that allows for that exploration in that perspective. Sometimes it is the other way around. A white person is set down in our midst, but the contrast is just as sharp for me. For instance, when I sit in the drafty basement that is the New World Cabaret with a white person, my color comes. We enter chatting about any little nothing that we have in common and are seated by the jazz waiters. In the abrupt way that jazz orchestras has, this one plunges into a number. It loses no time in circumlocations, but gets right down to business. It constricts the thorax and splits the heart with its tempo and narcotic harmonies. The orchestra grows rambunctious, rears on its hind legs, and attacks the tonal veil with primitive fury, rending it, clawing it until it breaks through to the jungle beyond. I follow those heathen, follow them exultingly. I dance wildly inside myself. I yell within. I whoop. I shake my asagi above my head. I hurl it true to the mark. I am in the jungle and living in the jungle way. My face is painted red and yellow, and my body is painted blue. My pulse is throbbing like a war drum, and I want to slaughter something, give pain, give death to what I do not know. But the piece ends, the men in the orchestra wipe their lips, and the rest their fingers. I creep back slowly to the veneer, to the lie. Because in modernism, we are aware of the savagery of which men are capable of creating. And so here she's connecting with that in a way what we would classify as masculine, but that strength, that power of the past, of the war, of the freedom, of that unquestionable, unpredictable, outside of Western influence standardization. I creep back slowly to the veneer we call civilization with the last tone and find the white friend sitting there motionless in his seat, smoking calmly. It's also just a way of looking and being like, Oh, this is all so new for you. The next line is, how some jazz I got here, or something like that. It's just such a funny way that she uses that voice to to halt this like this primal, calm, beautiful, growing, organic connection that she has. It's like, yeah, like white culture for the first time is really like terrified at the absurdity and pointlessness, brutality and savagery that man is capable of. But uh, we can argue that maybe, not just maybe, that Black Americans are very well acquainted with just how dehumanizing and horrific uh, society can be. Just the cruelty that man is capable of because they'd already experienced it. That veneer, that veil of a civilization has always been broken. So perhaps that's one of the reasons that we want to we have a tendency to keep um, um, what am I trying to say? Perhaps that's one of the reasons we have a tendency to teach the Harlem Renaissance as if it's self-contained, because there isn't that shock that we see in other modernists, that new anxiety. Instead, it's an anxiety that's always been there. In one of my favorite passages in American literature. But in the main, I feel like a brown bag of miscellany propped against the wall in the company of other bags, white, red, and yellow, pour out their contents, and there is discovered a jumble of small things, priceless and worthless, of first water diamond, an empty spool, bits of broken glass, lengths of string, a key to a door long since crumbled away, a rusty knife blade, old shoes saved for a road that never was and never will be, a nail bent under the weight of things too heavy for any nail, a dried flower or two, still a little fragrant. In your hand is the brown bag. On the ground before you is the jumble it held. So much like the jumble in the bags, could they be emptied that all might be dumped in a single heap, and the bags refilled without altering the content of any greatly, a bit of colored glass more or less, would not matter. Perhaps that is how the great stuffer of bags filled them in the first place. Who knows? We have that same use of objects as higher representation that we see in Frost, right? Frost uses tools, uses common objects associated with agriculture to show us his feeling of his inability to ever become, to show us his uselessness. And we see that here in Hurston, masterfully done, right? Where there's all of these lists of objects that can never fulfill their purpose. And that's what she's been given, but then is it just her? Perhaps the nail, perhaps there's definitely a reference to her individual experience throughout. The diamond, the first water diamond comes back over and over again. The rusty knife blade comes back over and over again, right? But then we end with perhaps that is how the great stuffer of bags filled them in the first place. Who knows? So we made it. We made it through our first lecture, and now I'm going to have you do a free writing exercise where I want you to add these to your journal, but they're not they're not in substitution of the 3 writings that you have to do per week. Instead, this is just, to help supplement lecture since we aren't going to have that in-person interaction anymore. And I want you to sit and I want you to write about what objects are in your bag. Right? There's always a hairbrush in my bag, and we can talk about what that is and what does the hairbrush look like. But what I want you to do now is I want you to sit and I want you to write about what would be in your bag. And so in a free write, you're just writing. You're not being critical of what you're writing. You're not really even, your task is not necessarily to stay on point. All you're being tasked with or asked to do is to write for 5 minutes on this concept in some way until you hear the timer go off. Begin. Almost done. Right for only we're a little bit more than halfway done. Think about what's in your bag. Think about the weight of the bag. Who is the great stuffer of bags? Do you have that sense of a higher entity? Or are you like Frost? Do you feel like you're a child playing at life alone and having to learn the significance of the birch? Push yourself. You're almost done. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Yay! We did it! All right, you guys made it through your first lecture. Remember that I'm going to be uploading these free writing exercises throughout our lectures. This one, it came at the end, but who knows where the next one will lie. I will have a video on your essay 2 uploaded by next week. I'm looking forward to reading your papers. And I also wanted to say that I'm extending the deadline for your daily question to Thursday. I'm a little behind, and so I guess y'all are probably a little behind. So just take until Thursday to get those done this week. Have a great day. Stay safe. Be healthy. Make good choices. And I will see you soon through the screen, right?